Welcome to the State of the Sector, a community research webinar. In this short introduction, we're going to tell you what you can expect of the next hour or so, and also how you can interact and ask questions of this event as it goes along, so as to make it truly participatory. Today's event will be hosted by me, Jan Hind, and our presenter will be Garth Nowland-Foreman, giving us his take on the state of the community sector and what the latest research is telling us. Responding to Garth will be Kim Himoana Penetito of Unitec's not-for-profit management course and Annelise Myers of Point Research. So here's our agenda for the next hour or so. After each section, we wish to take questions from you, the audience, and so we encourage you to get your questions in early and to use this opportunity to find out how you can put a question to us. But don't leave it too late to ask us your questions, because we want to be able to interact with you. So for the next hour, grab a cup of tea, test out your controls now. There's nothing that you can actually break in front of you. And how to ask questions? Well, if you're watching on Google Hangouts, you can click top right-hand corner of the screen and pull out this Q&A box where you can put your questions to the presenters. Alternatively, if you're watching on our YouTube channel, there's a live chat box which you can use again to put questions. You can text us on this number, 021 821 850, or you can tweet us at Good Research or hashtag Good Research to tweet this event. Thanks from the team at Community Research. We always love to hear from you. It's great that you're here for this webinar today. Thank you from the Board of Community Research. This is still a relatively new experience for us, so we want to know how did we get on. You'll soon receive a short survey, and we'd be really grateful if you'd fill it in. So today's webinar will be recorded, and the proceedings will be available almost immediately from our YouTube page, so you can go back and replay or share or pass this on to others. We're all about sharing learning within our sector. And on that note, we hope that we all want to tune in for the next community research webinar on Tuesday, the 17th of March, when Margie Jean Malcolm will be giving an interactive workshop about leadership within the community sector and what we can learn about the role of being learning leaders in our sector. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and we hope you'll jump on and interact and participate in today's event.
Kia ora tātou, and hello everyone. I'll start with a confession. I'm a webinar virgin, so I'm very excited to see how this happens. And I want to talk today about the state of the tangata whenua community and voluntary sector. And I want to do that in three parts. First of all, I want to talk about who are we, and then to talk about what's happening to us, and then what might lie ahead, especially as we come to terms with the outcomes focus that is top of the government's agenda, policy agenda at the moment. So, first of all, who are we? Right. Who are we? I thought this picture kind of summarised us very well, because we're big but cuddly, like those giant fluffy ducks that have been travelling around the world at different times. All up, there are 97,000 non-profits in this country, non-profit organisations. That's using an international definition that has 5 parts. They're organised in some way, that they don't distribute a surplus or profits to any owner or investor, that they're institutionally separate from government, that they are, in fact, they're self-governing, and that there's no compulsory membership or contribution. In other words, voluntary participation. So that's a lot of organisations. Almost 2/3 of them have no legal status. That's what unincorporated means. They're just people who've got together and are doing something. No one even necessarily might know what they're doing or where they're doing it, and they're on no one's register, which certainly also makes them hard to count. 22% of them are registered as incorporated societies, and 15% as charitable trusts. So when you hear research about charities, it's only about an eighth of the total not-for-profit sector if we're taking the broad definition. Even still, we employ over 100,000 paid staff and almost 500,000 volunteers. So there's a lot of people involved. So the incorporated societies, the percent as charitable. We get a good press, and people are often saying very nice things about us. Last year, the then Minister for the Community and Voluntary Sector said community groups are the backbone of sport, social groups, emergency service organisations, conservation, the arts, cultural groups. These institutions and the people who are part of them make a most significant contribution to New Zealand society and the economy. So everyone says we're important, but in reality we're usually left out or pushed to the back of the public policy queue. For example, the latest stats, the ones that I'm talking about, were collected more than a decade ago. Yet GDP is measured every quarter, 4 times a year. That's 40 times more frequently. But even from those old stats, there's some important lessons to learn. And the first is we are big, bigger than a lot of people thought. We're equivalent to a $9.8 billion, not million, but billion-dollar industry. That's about the same size as manufacturing, and it's about 2 or 3 times the construction industry, the transport and communication industry. So that means we, in terms of value added, we add 4.9% to GDP. In terms of our economic size. And when you put all those people into full-time equivalents, paid and volunteers, that adds up to around 200,000 full-time equivalents, which is the same as 1 in 10 of the working age population. So 1 in 2/3 of the not-for-profit's workforce are volunteers, and the volunteer component of our workforce is higher than most. In this case, we get to be 50% higher than the Aussies, and higher than almost every other country where it is measured. So we are very much a volunteer sector. And in fact, 90% of organisations employ no paid staff. 90% of non-profits employ no paid staff. We also forget at our peril, when I talk about the sector overall, that we're much more than service providers. The international study that I'm getting a lot of this data from coined the phrase expressive organisations and service delivery organisations. So expressive organisations are those where it's not just about providing a service, it's as much about citizen participation. So you're not just being funded for a contract as fueling social capital, weaving a sense of belonging and providing opportunities for citizen engagement. These so-called expressive organisations represent at least half of the non-profit workforce, including volunteers in Aotearoa New Zealand. And this is proportionately, again, bigger than our Aussie brothers and sisters, bigger than the Anglo-Saxon countries as a whole, and bigger than the average of all the countries measured. So only the Nordic countries in the north of Europe just tip us to the post with 57% of their workforce being in these so-called expressive organisations. So participation, community engagement, working together to achieve common goals is as much important in our sector as providing services for someone else. Okay. And another slide will come through in a minute. We forget at our peril also that we generate most of our own income. because it's often probably generates more work for us, we often think that we are a government-funded sector. The government likes to think we are a government-funded sector, but the New Zealand figures show that government funding is much more modest than most suppose. The actual research showed that it was 25%. It's probably not quite as low as that. The reason it came up low on those figures is because the health ministries weren't able to tell us how much money they give to non-for-profits, which is telling in itself. But so it's likely to be bigger than 25%, maybe 35%, but that's still a minority of our income source. Private philanthropy is high. It provides 20%, and that's higher than most other countries in the world. And that includes private donations. More than 2 million New Zealanders donate every year, and also includes philanthropic trusts. It includes our almost unique sector of community trusts, which New Zealand has, that very few other countries have something quite like that. So we need to keep in mind that we're not a sector owned by somebody else. We generate most of our own income because all the rest comes from fees, interest, and other self-generated income. Okay, so that's who we are. I'd also like to talk a little bit about what's happening to us before we move on to looking at what's ahead with this focus on outcomes. So, what is happening to us at the moment? Elsewhere, I've described how the extremes of the government contracting regime, when applied to community organisations in the 1990s, risks killing the sector golden old goose that could lay the golden eggs of belonging, participation, and the spirit of giving that we've just been talking about. In short, much of the inclusive and vibrant society that we really usually want for ourselves and for our children and our children's children. Since the 2000s, or the noughties, as some people like to refer to them, that threat is thankfully much more widely understood, but has not yet fully disappeared. It reasserts itself every time public policy treats community organisations as just little fingers of the state. Every time we see community organisations as just another set of service providers to be contracted in the same way you can turn a tap on and off, with a perpetual reservoir of goodwill just sitting there waiting to gush forth at the prescribed pressure and the prescribed direction of each funder's edict. The threat reasserts itself every time we add one more layer of compliance costs and regulation to community engagement, every time we end up demanding rigidity and risk aversion in the name of so-called accountability, but in fact undermine true responsibility and responsiveness to the people and communities, family and whānau that we serve. The threat reasserts itself every time we make it harder or more complicated for people to volunteer or give. Though I should acknowledge here that in 2008, this current government turned around the tax burden on individual giving and corporate giving from one of the meanest regimes in the OECD to one of the most encouraging. So that has been a big step forward. Despite some explicit acknowledgement of volunteers in public policy, we say most of the right words, unfortunately it still continues to get tougher for volunteers, not only with squeezes on their time and availability, but also with creeping regulations and so-called accountability requirements and risk management for our volunteer board and committee members, as well as our volunteer program providers, fundraisers and activists. Historically, especially compared to others, the New Zealand not-for-profit sector has not been tightly regulated, and this has been important in facilitating its diversity and flexibility and its comparative advantage and what it's contributed to this country. Just recently, ComVoices undertook a State of the Sector snapshot for 2014, and they got a strong response with over 300, mostly social service and disability service providers participating. But it tells us a picture of under pressure, doing more work for ever less money, struggling to retain qualified staff, seeing threats to traditional collaboration, and a few even facing imminent closure. So the research reports a high level of frustration and urgency by non-profits that deliver services, and a lack of understanding from funders, both government and philanthropic, according to those non-profits, about their administrative and infrastructure needs. It's also disturbing that 60% of them said they were no longer prepared to speak out publicly on the issues they were facing. These are not new pressures in 2014. 3 years earlier, Grant Thornton's survey of the not-for-profit sector found this theme so strong, it titled that year's report, Survival, the Ongoing Challenge of Having to Deliver More for Less. This has been a creeping story that we're all familiar with. In fact, we don't need to talk much about it because it is, after all, a familiar and oft-told story.
Which brings us back to me. So, first of all, I would say thanks very much for your messages that are coming through. And if you've any questions or comments to Garth based on what he's presented there, we'd love to hear your questions. We'd love to hear from you. And our friend Lawrence is here monitoring the chat feed in the background. So we have the combined brains and talent of Kim Penetito and also Annelise Myers here. And I wondered if I could hand over to the two of you to say, have you any thoughts or comments on the picture that Garth has just painted to you? How does that tie into your own worldviews?
Kia ora tātou. I guess I want to go back to...
Oh. And Kim is just on the...
That's our special sound. That's your entrance into the conversation.
Kia ora tātou. I just want to go back to right at the beginning when Garth was talking about the voluntary sector being the backbone of Aotearoa society at present, and reflecting on the notion of the backbone of a whare nui, and the backbone in respect of jury's model of whare tapawhā, and thinking along those lines of the analogy of how not-for-profit organisations are, if you like, propping up the social sector in Aotearoa, and the backbone, the tuara of this being the not-for-profit sector, and how it's based on strength-based, it's based on people's passion and values to contribute and to be active in community development. However, it seems to be the tinana, the taha tinana, that is suffering, as in the resourcing of how that backbone is supported. When we look at the other tapa of the whare tapawhā, it looks at te wairua, te hinengaro, me te whānau, which is what Garth responded to when he was talking about relationships with government, with each other, around capability to do with hinengaro, and how organisations are able to survive or are trying to survive in this environment, and our wairua, how sustainable that structure is for community alongside government, alongside business. So I just wanted to kind of add that thought, if you like, that if we look at that, the sector in respect of te whare tapawhā, the thing that is letting us down, if you like, the thing that is vulnerable is te taha tinana, based on the relationship that the sector is having with the whole resourcing side of things.
For everyone. For me, when I was listening to you, Garth, there was a sense that the way that you've framed up sort of where we are and who we are, really, it makes me think back to when I was little and I'd be sitting on the floor and my parents would be organising some kind of social action that would support some kind of social change. And I imagine that they had this vision that if only we could get these other players in around the table, we'd be able to have more effect. And here we are with the very thing our parents may have wanted, which was to government to be more involved and people with money to donate. And we now have our own set of challenges with having those partnerships or those different people around the table. And it was really helpful for me to just get that snapshot around thinking how many New Zealanders are really wanting to have some kind of social action that they're part of, even if it's mentoring a young person or coaching a team, right through to running a not-for-profit organisation. But a sense that actually these are our challenges right now in 2014, and thinking about what are we going to do on our watch.
Yes. Yes, so I think the fact is that the centre of society is voluntary action, people working together for things. And as you say, Annelise, in a sense, always has been. And one of the risks is not just not enough money, but as more money and resources have been poured into our sector, it's becoming more formalised, and expectations can become rigid, that in a way that they can undermine the special value that not-for-profit, values-based community action can provide for people. So that's the challenge we've got to somehow navigate into the future. So maybe that's a good time to talk about what lays ahead. Of course, there are lots of things that we have to face in the future, but the one we're going to focus on today is potentially the flavour of the month. So I've got a picture for flavour of the month. That is outcomes. And a focus on outcomes and outcomes measurement. So different things have been flavour of the month, and it's sometimes easy to think, oh no, if we just grin and bear it, this will go away. But got some bad news for you. This is not just a random preoccupation of one government in one country. This has actually been an issue for governments of various persuasions and private philanthropists as much as government funders for at least the last 20, 25 years. There's been some faltering steps forward, but it's persisted as a concern. And I think the reason it's persisted as a concern, not only in New Zealand but internationally, is because at its heart it does tackle something really important. It tackles results. Are we not just doing nice things but actually making a difference? And that's why in one way this is absolutely nothing new for our sector. Because as values-based organisations, we're always concerned about making a difference. That's what drives us. It's not the profit motive, it's not regulation, it's the ability to make a difference in communities. So that trend was again picked up in the name that Grant Thornton gave their most recent not-for-profit survey, done in 2013, which they called Doing Good and Doing It Well. With echoes of those of you familiar with results-based accountability, a book of a similar name. But that's just one more piece of evidence that this is a top-line preoccupation. But it's not simple. It's by no means as simple as it sounds. And in fact, from the ComVoices snapshot of social service and health and disability and providers and other organisations in this country, many of their responses demonstrated a fairly high level of cynicism, you'd have to say. While they wanted a positive partnership with government and with others, and they look forward to holistic and innovative solutions being developed, most felt that the current reality was much more adversarial and low trust and dog eat dog, to put it bluntly. Just over a third of the comments about the contracting and funding environment in particular expressed concerns like the demands to increase outcomes and numbers without the funding to match, or only funding pet projects or things focused on a crisis rather than funding core services or things that might actually be at the top of the cliff and prevent bad things happening or develop people to be more resilient. There was a feeling often reported that the government and other funders were only interested in outputs and numbers, and especially those that supported their agenda, and a lack of transparency about how some of these decisions were being made. There's also a lot of comments, about a quarter of them related to how increased competition in the sector caused by competitive tendering and reduced funding actually made it harder to achieve results. That they impact negatively on relationships. They pitched larger organisations against smaller ones, and a lot of the smaller or medium-sized ones thought that they were behind the eight ball, and basically that they had might be being given their marching orders. So it's an issue. It's been around for some time, and it's something that we need to deal with. And at its heart, this focus on outcomes is something we should welcome. And the best organisations have always been focused on outcomes in one way or another. The issue is how that happens. In fact, that Grant Thornton survey found that 86% of the New Zealand non-profits, this for the first time was an Australasian survey, but 86% of the New Zealand non-profits reported that they outline their key outcomes or impacts to their stakeholders. And that they reported them usually annually or monthly in line with their usual governance reporting. Donor-funded programs were more likely to be reported on at the end of the project, and there are only 23% of organisations who never reported on the outcomes or results of their programs. And often this was about not having the resources to do so. However, I think some of that terminology was pretty loose in what people meant in terms of reporting on outcomes, and it certainly covers many more things than some of the government and philanthropic funders are looking for, and because they often report that they're not getting the information that they need. Interestingly, I was involved with a pilot of the social audit tool in this country about 15 years ago, and while people even then complained about being inundated with requests for data collection, they actually analysed very little of what they collected. So it's no good having a lot of information and not using it to change or learn from. That's just going through the motions. And the uncomfortable truth was they hardly ever collected anything that was not demanded by funders, even when they knew the funders were asking the wrong questions or asking silly questions, or were not asking the things that really made a difference. They were so focused on meeting the funders' needs that they didn't collect the information that was most important for them. And in particular, while they had lots of quantitative data, which they dismissed as not being the most useful stuff, they said qualitative data was what was really important. They very rarely collected in any systematic way qualitative data, partly because it wasn't required by the funders at that stage. So those two things overlapped it. Now, they weren't just being belligerent. There were very good reasons behind this gap between the rhetoric and the reality. While non-profits are, at least in theory, are highly committed to achieving impact and results, they often treat particular versions of outcomes reporting with a wry smile, if not ruffled annoyance, because they've been through it before. Just let me give you one example. A few years ago, I was working with helping a budgeting service in another wave of focus on outcomes, and the government funder came out to the service and said to them, well, we're now moving, we're not going to fund inputs anymore, so we're not going to fund hours of budgeting, we're going to fund outcomes. So you need to get ready for that. And that budgeting service was a particularly thoughtful one, and they said, yeah, that's really good. We've never really done that before. That's been a lack on our part. We're going to do some thinking, talking to our clients and volunteers and other people, and do some work on what we think would be useful outcomes to report on. They went away and did that, and that's what they engaged me to help them do some work on, and they came back with some indicators under three basic headings. One was about whether the people they worked with had a more positive attitude to being in control of their finances rather than their finances being in control of them, because they believed that having a proactive approach to their finances was the first step to actually being in control. They had a couple of indicators about whether the people had better knowledge about budgeting and the basics of what was required, and they had a couple of indicators about whether behaviour had changed in the families after they'd had the budgeting support. And they thought, they're not perfect, but this is really exciting. We'll be able to start measuring these things and know if we're really making a difference. So they reported back to their funding liaison officer, who looked slightly embarrassed and said, that's great that you've done that, but actually Wellington have come up with these three measures that all budgeting services are going to do. Ironically, they weren't even outcome measures. They were, bizarrely, number of clients serviced for under 3 months, number of clients serviced for 3 to 6 months, and number of clients who you're still servicing after 6 months. This was based on some theory that quick is always good, and that therefore that if you've got very difficult people with intractable problems that need a lot of effort to help them change major parts of their life, then that's bad because you'll get in the 6 months plus category. The budgeting service was a little taken aback by these proposals and said, well, actually, they don't measure outcomes. They measure the best activities, because we'd actually had quite a lot of good discussions about what an outcome was by that stage. And the funding officer, trying to work out a compromise, said, well, if you like, you can count your things on top of the ones you have to report to our department. Sadly, they never did. Because they never have enough time to do all the nice to haves, so they just did what they had to do, the meaningless activity counts, and left behind the chance to really get an insight into which of their work made a difference, because it was just too expensive for them when their funding didn't recognise these infrastructure costs of actually doing your own learning.
Garth, do you think that's commonplace where organisations are in that in the situation where it feels like they have to make a choice between the indicators that they might see as the real things that would make them give them information that they are making a difference, and the indicators that they're given? Do you think this is commonplace?
I think one of the reasons it makes it more common than it should be is that there's been an excessive emphasis on making sure no one has any spare capacity, and too much emphasis on frontline services and not enough on the infrastructure and support that goes into good frontline services. We know from international research, unfortunately not New Zealand research, that if you compare non-profits with businesses of the same size and with the same budget and staffing numbers, that the non-profits spend about 40% less on the backroom functions. Because the commercial organisations have an incentive to invest in whatever makes a difference. And they know that a solid investment in those backroom functions like learning, reflection, staff development, R&D actually results in better sales and profits. Unfortunately, for non-profits, the things that are most effective don't get you more money. We have to manage two parallel circles, income and outcome. And better outcomes don't get you more income. What gets you more income is convincing people. Now, theoretically, if you can present better arguments about achieving outcomes, hopefully that will convince people. But the problem in the real world with the implementation of an outcomes approach is that in country after country, and there's a very good example of how they did it so badly in New South Wales with community services, just across the ditch, the government comes with a predetermined agenda of what it wants to measure, which is not necessarily about learning and improvement and the outcomes of the organisation. So they become more interested in having a uniform thing that they can add together. So I call that the preoccupation with addability instead of accountability.
See, I see it slightly differently. As someone who has led quite a significant development project, for me, having your own criteria and developing a reflective practice to make sure that you're actually working towards that, to me, that's day-to-day work. If we think this is on top, we are creating a separation between we're thinking that revenue equates a cause and effect to outcomes. Where often it was when I would ask a staff member, how did that go? And they would say, oh, we got 15 young mums and 1 young dad. And I would say, this is a 2-year project, it's not good enough. We're going to have to go back and think how we're going to get young parents involved. So it was that idea that right at the beginning, as soon as we got an inkling that something hadn't quite worked, our theory of it changed, our assumptions underneath hadn't equated to engagement, it was right then and there that I worked with my staff to think, what could we do? And it transformed the project. We then ended up with 15 young dads involved because we thought, what have we not done right? For me, if as a sector, we think that funding and 100% funding is going to create the whole answer, I think we're going to spend a lot of time feeling exhausted, and maybe there's some other ways of looking at it. What I've found is when I look at where change is happening, often funding follows. Rather than thinking that funding enables innovative change, think about that innovative change can be a leader towards where social policy may follow, rather than the other way around. I don't know what you think about that, but that's just what came into my mind as I was listening.
Yep. I think that approach is absolutely crucial because it is that mindset. And the most important thing about outcomes is just having a focus on, are we doing the right things and are we achieving them, what we hope to achieve, what's getting in the way, what's working, what's not working. And so often the best outcomes stuff is not sophisticated data collection. It's a culture in an organisation. And I think what you described is a culture of critical self-reflection, of linking your day-to-day work with your big picture mission and vision and not getting swamped by the day-to-day tasks, so that always you're moving back and forth between what are we here for, why do we want to make a difference, rather than just getting trapped in the activities. And that's the most useful part of an outcomes focus. It helps us to lift ourselves above the activities level. I think that's when it's really useful. I think it might be useful just to talk a little bit about what we mean by outcomes and where that concept comes from, if that's okay. So I'll just find my slide to do this. And I'm just going to go through a couple of things that I don't want to talk about, and just talk about measuring outcomes. And I'll come back to that because in the end you'll see that I think measuring outcomes is the least important thing. But the concept of outcomes actually comes from the factory production line, the assembly line, and it fits really well with Henry Ford inspired Great Leap Forward of the assembly line, which made things manufacturing more efficient. That you start down at the bottom, as it is in this picture, with your input, which are the resources that you have, and then there's the throughput or activities of what you do with them, or that's the manufacturing part, and then there's the output, the stuff that falls off the assembly line. That's your objectives, your immediate outcomes, your immediate outputs. Then the outcomes, what difference those things make in and how they get used. And then some people have added impact and differentiated that from outcome to mean the vision or the longer term change in society. So we move through from what you need to the things you do, through to who are the direct results and beneficiaries, through to the long-term changes in those beneficiaries, through to the big picture changes into society. And obviously, if we have our vision too low, if we're stuck just on the inputs or the activities, the throughputs, we can easily get distracted and disconnected from our big picture vision. And so keeping that line and that vision on the outcomes and impact that we're trying to achieve is quite important. In fact, I think the real problems. Before a problem, a handy hint. If you're doing a outcome hierarchy for your organisation, a great way of checking that they're well aligned is that each step up should answer the why of the previous step. So why do you need those inputs or resources in order to do those activities or throughputs? Why do you do those activities or throughputs in order to achieve those outputs? Why do you have those outputs in order to achieve those outcomes? And why do you focusing on those outcomes in order to achieve those impacts? So if there's a nice why chain, it probably means you've successfully drawn up your own little outcomes hierarchy. And as a double check, going backwards, you can ask the question, how? So starting with the big picture impact, if you ask how will that be achieved, the answer should be your outcomes, the long-term changes. And if you ask how those should be achieved, the answer should be the outputs, the direct results. And if you ask how those should be achieved, the answer should be your throughputs. And if you ask how those will be achieved, the answer should be the resources that you use. So you can check you've got a nice little outcomes hierarchy. But there are problems once we get into the task of measuring outcomes. It always sounds simple in the workshop and in the textbook than in reality. Because as you go up that staircase of hierarchy, it becomes harder to measure. It's much easier to measure inputs, staff time, room rental, publicity material budget, than it is to measure happier society, more empowered women, all those kind of things. Also, as you step up the hierarchy, things are more ambiguous. It's not always clear whether something has happened. When you're doing an activity, it's quite clear usually whether it has or hasn't happened. And that's because you are in control of it in your organisation. So as you go up the scale, you're less in control. So you have quite a lot of control over what resources you marshal and what activities you do. But there are lots of other factors that will have an impact on the impact and the outcome. And you have to wait longer to see. And the bigger the changes, often the longer you have to wait. So if we're really interested in long-range social changes, then we might have to wait quite a while. And usually we don't want to wait that long to get the funding. And there's this phrase that evaluators and economists, interestingly, also use about there being more externalities. What that means is that there are more factors outside of which we have control that influence the outcomes. What other people do is as important as what we do. One organisation alone rarely affects, really is alone in affecting an outcome, let alone an impact. But the thing that keeps us still want to focus there is it's actually more significant. We are here because we're committed to the outcomes and impacts, not because we're so, love the inputs and the throughputs. And if we get, so we still need to have that focus somehow on the outcomes and the impacts without getting trapped into all the measurement problems. And we've talked a little bit about this, why it can be difficult. Pressure to minimise overheads. There's a competitive environment, so how can we be honest? As we've moved into more services being contracted, they are prescribed what we will provide. So often there's less things you need to learn because you either do this or you don't. And sometimes even the evaluation or the monitoring and reporting, as I've talked about, is prescribed. So you're just going through someone else's hoops rather than doing your own learning. But also, Annelise, as you've said, we can be our own worst enemy. And there is stuff that we have control over that we can do something about. Sometimes our activist culture, I think, makes us a little bit anti-intellectual and a little bit anti-reflection because you're not doing something. And I think that's maybe even more exaggerated in the number 8 wire, just roll your sleeves up, anyone can do it yourself culture of Aotearoa New Zealand. So stopping and thinking becomes a luxury, not a better way of doing. Just ask any man whether he's read the instruction manual before he tries assembling something. Doing it on the cheap, because not only do funders want to keep overheads low, but we promise them. We fall into that trap of saying we can do something for a price that we can't, a price that means we cut short the training, the R&D, the learning, the collaborating with others. And finally, one that I'm reluctant to name, but in the cause of honesty will, and that's what I call the sin of niceness. And I think that is something that's endemic in our sector even more than some other parts of society. Rather than confronting uncomfortable truths, we're not actually doing as well as we thought. We sometimes just like to be nice. But there's nothing very effective and good about being nice in that pejorative sense, because it's only when we confront the uncomfortable truths, confront the things that are not working, that we can do better, that we can learn, that we can improve. So my lessons from that are that it's more important to focus on the outcomes than on measuring things. And definitely never look at what you can measure first. That's the biggest trap, I think. Don't worry if the outcome is totally unmeasurable, because it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. It's better to have a rough measure of the right thing than a precise measure of the wrong thing. And often the most important thing I've found in an organisation is agreeing what success looks like and having those conversations about what success and a good outcome looks like. And that means having a good balance between the long and the short term. We need to live in the short term, but the long term is just a whole lot of short terms. So we need to make sure that we are leading to those long-term goals and outcomes. And one of the biggest killers, I think, is a command and control approach, whether it's funders in their relationship to us or internally in the way we run our own organisations. If we're always telling people what to do, there's less incentive to learn. We need to make an empowerment and encouragement approach, and that gives a very big incentive for us all to learn and really value the open inquiry, the responsiveness, the reflection, and the ability to change things. Yeah, so what does it all mean? Focusing on what does it all mean, I think. So sitting around wasting time talking about what we're trying to achieve is, I think, one of the best investments of time any organisation makes, and then making sure that what we do aligns with that. And if we can get some rough indicators that we're in the right direction, then that's all good and well. And in particular, I don't think we need to always prove what we're doing, partly because we'll almost never have the quasi-experimental random control capabilities because of size or budget. But also, we can stand on other people's backs. We can look at what the literature shows is a good way to engage young people, or what the evidence of our colleagues already shows is a good way to reach out to homeless people, or to help homeless people take more control of their lives. We don't have to work as if we're the only person in the universe working on this. There is intelligent life out there, and it's written a lot of the stuff down. So learning from each other and sharing, I think, is an important part. And then we can just check that we're on track. So these days, I'm just as interested in what some people call intermediate outcomes. So if we're achieving those things, are we likely to be on track to achieving the long-term goals? And that comes back to having some theory of change or some logic chain that says if we do this and do this, it's likely to lead to that. If there's evidence to support that, great. If it just seems logical and defensible, then that is quite good, I think. Okay, so that's about where I've got to in my thinking about these issues.
I might ask you to mute then, Garth, and I'll maybe ask Kim and Annelise to have a think about any comments or questions that you have. And in the meantime, I just want to point people to a couple of resources that are on our site, which will help them in the next steps on their journey. And then we might even talk about next steps or responses there. Garth has referred to, so going back one, Garth referred to the State of the Sector survey. So I'm just going to screen share. We're all doing this for the first time, by the way. Can you tell? Have I screened? No, I haven't. I'm just going to screen share for you and show you a couple of links. I hope that that's working. Could someone give me a nod? Here on the community research website is the State of the Sector survey that Garth was quoting from earlier. We don't have the Grant Thornton survey, but you'll see also a piece which we refer back to again and again is Sandra Gray's work, the fears, constraints and contracts that are currently impinging on our sector. So I suppose I'm going back one there to show you where you can find some source material. And I've been listening, Garth, as you've been talking, you know, your theory of change, your models of how we reflect and learn together, how we start to measure and become more accountable as a sector. To be a little more forward-thinking, further down the line, we aim to be collecting some of these resources on our website for community research through a new collection, which will be called What Works. Now, more of that later, but I can see a couple of questions have come in online, and what I want to do now, actually, is just to hand over to Annelise and Kim. Meanwhile, you'll see that there's an interesting discussion being taken place between Tim Pratt and Hazel Jennings. By Aotearoa. And if you have questions, if you'd like to pick Garth's brains, if you'd like to pick Kim and Annalise's brains, do drop us a question in the live chat feed there. So I'll stop my screen share and
look at reclaiming some control, if you like, and acknowledging that community have the power to create change and to advocate change. And, you know, this control of funding, if you like, has created what Garth refers to as, you know, a muzzling, as a fear of speaking out, etc., etc. And some things are beyond our control, like the funding that we receive, but other things that Garth has spoken about is that whole collecting the data, collecting what works for us without being prompted by government, without having a sense of, is this ticking the box in order for us to gain additional funding, but more so collecting what's important for that community to be able to gauge and be accountable to their own community about the work that they're doing and how it's affecting their community. I refer to resources like PATH that are on the community research website, where there are whole communities being trained in this as a planning tool, and that you're going right back to the beginning of getting more community members involved in the whole aspiration end of things about what do you want for your community, and then leaving it, having input, but actually trusting that the organisations that have facilitated that process are going to use that in order to achieve what the community as a whole are saying are their aspirations for change, for improvement, etc. I swear by having seen some organisations go through the PATH process of how empowering it's been for them and how much more in control they have been about what data they collect, how they collect it, that it's done more creatively via hui with their community on a regular basis, that those hui are recorded, that children are given cameras to capture what's important to them in their community, that movies are taken. I guess we're in this technical age where there are so many resources available and our young people are so good at it, and if we're looking at improving the future for them, then let them start capturing what's important to them so that they're informing us. Narratives out and about in the community, we tend to be bound by a outcomes-focused paper trail that says you've got to hit the mark on all these areas here. Yes, we know that that's what government are measuring us against. I refer to another website called tapawhā, K-A-T-O-A Limited, which is developed by Fiona Cram, and she's breaking down the language of outcomes and outcome logic models and saying, if this happens, then that should occur. If, you know, it just, I guess, dispelling the myth that it's all government jargon that we have to be following in government process, and allow you to use whatever tools that are going to work for you to help take back the power of measurement of the outcomes for you and your community.
I work for Point Research, and we're a sort of research company, and one of the things that we did is just develop a small website called Capturing Change. .co.nz, and you're welcome to have a look at it, and it's just for anybody to use with just tiny little tips for the small little organisations who just want to see what difference are we making for whom and how do we know. And those three key questions, and finding, you know, where do you start? Do you start with the output? You know, your fund is saying how many people came. What does that number mean to you? You know, did you think you might get 15 and you got 7? And finding out from the 7 who didn't end up finishing something might be the biggest, and then you think, gosh, how did it one time of the year in the freezing cold and none of the teenagers had transport? Whatever it is, that sense of trying to keep it, take the power back, but also keeping it as simple as it needs to be meaningful. One of the things, Garth, you were talking around the theory of change, and some of our audience may know about that or not. It might be something. I just wondered about some of about theory of change. Has a key part of it is around our key assumptions, and I'm just wondering about what that might do to an organisation, being able to work with some of those. Wondering if you have any thoughts about that key part of using a theory of change or developing a theory of change about working with.
And can you mute now, and we'll leave you unmuted.
Okay.
Sorry about that flushing, everybody.
That's all right. You need a full-time mute to do this, I think. But the there are a lot of technical terms in this field, and they can scare people off, and that they needn't, because the basic concepts are really simple. And sometimes I think the what some people call, the $10 words that get invented, because people think it's not important if it's just an ordinary 4-letter word. But the theory of change is just trying to work out why we think doing this stuff every day is somehow linked to achieving our vision for a better world. So what's the link? And as a part of making that link explicit, it really helps us keep focused on that. So just doing that work is really good. And a path is a kind of theory of change that can be used at a personal, an organisational, and at a community level. But one of the key things when you're doing that, which is made explicit in the theory of change model, is you're saying, what are our assumptions? In other words, why do we think handing out pamphlets will reduce domestic violence? Will it really? Or is there actually something better we could do? What's the change we're wanting to see? And in fact, a good friend of mine, Hildy Gottlieb, always talks about beginning with the end in mind. And in fact, the best theories of change, in my experience, are always done backwards. Going forward is overrated. Start with the end. What is the change we want to see? And think, what would need to be in place for that to happen? And then you think, okay, once you've got that, what would need to be in place for that to happen? And once you've got that, you'll eventually get to a point and you say, well, what can we do that will help that happen? Because we need to be cautious about the things we take for granted, our assumptions. Because just because we've always done it this way doesn't necessarily mean it's the most effective way. And because we're committed as organisations to seeing a better world and seeing change happen, we've got a big incentive to finding the most effective way of doing things. If I can struggle with this technology, I want to share with you one thought about that issue.
Whilst Garth is doing that, can I just unmute? Can I unmute? So I think next time we do use of
Yes, I just want to tell you this little story if you haven't heard it before. I think it might be apocryphal or true, and who cares? It's true. It's got truth in it. But apparently, I'm told NASA spent $12 billion developing a space pen. That is a pen that would work in zero gravity. On the other hand, the Russians took a pencil. There's a lot of people in big agencies, in governments, in fancy consulting firms that are developing the equivalent of the $12 million space pen for accountability and outcomes. Whereas actually, we've all got the pencils that we can use, like taking photographs, like just talking to each other, like gathering stories. So let's not get distracted by the fancy space pen, and remember we've got a pencil in our back pocket.
So I'm just going to jump in. So if you would mute, Garth, and can you unshare your screen? There we go. That should bring me up. There are a couple of resources that are available that are not yet on our website, but once we built this site called the What Works, then I think that's exactly the kind of thing that we would be able to point people to. And one is the work of Paul Dignan, who of course received funding to travel and to come up with some models which would allow us, our sector, and also public sector, I think, to use the theory of change approach that Garth has been describing, and to capture the information which is capturable and useful, and sort of to work within our own resources. So Paul Dignan has some models which allow groups like us. And I also found a website called, I think it's toc.org, in the US, which I found pretty helpful for a small group to go online and to be able to develop a theory of change. Now I have, but Garth, you were talking about pencils and pens there. We have one question come through and a couple more, I believe, following on. Garth, let me take you back on to your earlier kōrero around your description of the sector and the fact that we're constantly under pressure to do more for less. And we know that we know that there's research to say that smaller scale NGOs are cheaper and more effective. So what do we make of that? And Tim Pratt is online sort of saying, and also if we understand that we are able to operate at 40% less back office costs, How do we understand, Tim, I think this is your question, what can we make of the fact that business is still seeming to be able to compete against us and occasionally, steal contracts away from us as well? How do we understand that being possible? What's going on there?
Okay. Now I'll turn my mic on. Hopefully you can hear me now. There's a lot of different questions in there that I'm hearing anyway. The one that I'll pick up on is that last point about how can business compete with us, for example, in contracts, when they do become competitive tendering, if they are on average spending 40% more on backroom costs, not overall, on backroom costs. One of the reasons is there's been some research in the industries in which both non-profits and commercial organisations operate. And internationally, the two industries where that's most prevalent is aged care and childcare, ironically. And not all the research, but about 80%, so the overwhelming body of the research, points to the fact that the big difference is commercial provision of those two things provide lower quality. It's as simple as that. They pay their staff less, they get less qualified staff, and they, on average, can operate successfully by providing a lower quality service, whether it's aged care or childcare. Now, that's on average. So there are some commercial organisations that do invest in people and in quality and in good customer or client outcomes, but there are others that don't. And there are more not-for-profits who put quality outcomes first rather than cost economies. And just as a simple illustration of that, a few years ago in New South Wales, in the childcare arena, if it were not for not-for-profits, there would be no childcare outside of Sydney, Wollongong, Newcastle, 3 towns. There would be, so 90% of the geography of the state would have no childcare because it's more expensive to provide childcare in rural areas. And they were, at that stage, 100% not-for-profits for that reason. So that's one of the reasons. I think one of the other things behind the underspend on infrastructure is we try and make it up in different ways. People do work hard because of their commitment to the cause. We have more unpaid volunteer labour, but sometimes we just actually miss out on the research and development that we could do, and that's sad.
There's a question.
Louise, and I think you're with one of the DHBs up in the Hutt Valley, Louise. I hope I've remembered that correctly. You've been sitting waiting patiently in the background and feeding us some thoughts on the stream there. And one of that you've just asked is, I suppose inevitably we had to end up here, RBA. And if I can just take a hold of Louise's question again, Louise is saying, RBA, your thoughts about RBA and how this may be keeping us focused on throughput, output measures. She adds another question after that about how can we advocate to ministries and the likes about what good indicators look like. That's a great question there, Louise. Anybody want to jump in there?
Hi, it's Annelise here. For me, I think I'd like to answer the last bit that you posed around how can we inform our funders understanding what good indicators are. I think that's key. When I was doing work around teen parents, I suddenly realised that actually social policy and people in government were the relationship that I created with them was key. So then what we started to do is do some of those things ourselves and share it with those people in government that were interested in this area. And an example of how that affected it is when they started to look at young dads, some of the work that they did around some guidelines to working with young dads, they created that in partnership with community. So they wouldn't have necessarily known what was going on in the community if we hadn't just picked up the phone and rang people. You know, people who are working in government around a lot of the stuff, they're just like us. They want to make a difference. And really it was through our piloting something, we suddenly realised, we thought we'd do mentoring for young dads one-on-one. getting the feedback from the mentors, it was too intense. They were like, oh my goodness, what do we do? So then we changed it and made it group mentoring, and then we followed and looked at the outcomes of group mentoring and had a look. Really positive for the young dads. The mums felt a bit jealous that the dads got to go and do all these fun activities and they didn't take their kids, so then we had to change some of those activities to make sure that it was family focused, not just taking one parent out of the context of their family. Actually, all that learning and capturing it as we went along, and then having it peer reviewed by someone who was happy to do that at no cost, just reading what we'd done and giving us feedback enabled us to inform what was coming next. And I think that that's key, to not see the people at the other end of a tender as not humans. All the systems that we have are set up by humans, and we inform them and we can change them. And I think that's a key part of our empowerment, is that sometimes it's not all of this is being done to us. We're contributing to a way of being in the world, and it's really important that if you take the time to look at your criteria to see if that starts to work, to then feedback with those that may be your partners or people who aren't even your partners but just may be interested. So I definitely think about that. It's really hard, the qualitative and the quantitative. In the work that I'm doing, we have a desk in our office and two staff are on one side and I'm on the, two of us are on this side, and we kind of joke that there's a line in between and we're the qualitative and they're the quantitative. But what I've kind of learned is that actually both give us much more of an understanding of the picture that we're working in. And, you know, we're working with an organisation who were having great numbers of young people engaged, and those numbers started to drop. Those numbers aren't the outcome, but they decided that those were the indicators that they needed to go and find out from those that didn't carry on why that was. And actually they were really simple things and they could change them, and within sort of a 5-week period they went from the numbers dropping down to 4, which meant they couldn't continue to deliver it, to now they run 2 groups at a time that suits those families, and they had 21 at each group on a Thursday and Friday, because they took the time to see that indicator as, oh, we better think about this. It wasn't seen as failure, it was seen as an indicator that they needed to think about something. I hope that helps you with I think with whatever model or thing that's coming through that the government's using or our funders are using or our organisation might use. I really welcome you to look at it, think what fits well with our values and our principles, what are the things that challenges us, which might be part of what you challenge your relationship with that funder to say, hey, we're really keen on this. This makes the hairs on our back stand up, and to have a conversation about those things.
Yeah. I'd just like to add, you know, I agree with what you're saying, Annelise, is that it's almost using that data, for want of a better word, to turn things around for yourself and how you use that information, because everyone can have a different interpretation of the same information that comes forward from gathering the results of a program or a project. So how you use that data, and I fully agree that relationships with people on the inside, or people who are your government allies, they have a responsibility, I guess, to advocate change from a policy point of view within their own organisations, and often they are looking for ways of doing that from the community. I'm in the education sector presently, and of course what we're being measured against is retention and success. And our challenge as tutors in that environment has been to look at the assessment process, and could it be done differently? And if it is going to be done differently, what would that look like? And what resource would be required in order to change that way of assessing outcomes of the student for the required workload. But it's an opportunity for us to feed into that. As tutors, we're delivering something, but we also are monitoring is the information getting through? And if the results of assessment say that it's not, then maybe we need to tweak our way of doing things, as well as look at the way that we're testing that knowledge getting through with our students. So I fully agree with that whole approach of turning results-based assessment around to work for your organisation.
Yeah, I think the things that you've said are really important. For me, numbers are really useful in helping you ask good questions. They hardly ever provide the answer. That's where it's the answers to the dilemmas that we face with are much more complex, ambiguous, and dynamic, and they depend on our insights as people together. So usually just collaborative dialogue is the best way to work that out, and the wider the breadth of people involved in that dialogue, the better. But without collecting some good numbers, we often don't know it's time to stop and ask the questions, as you gave examples there. What I like is the fact that the word data or datum has the same Latin root that we get donor, or because it means gift. So data is effectively just little gifts, and that's up to us to use those gifts, to appreciate them, and to use them to make something beautiful out of them. They're not ends in themselves, but we need to really use those gifts. On RBA specifically, I think it's important to always remember a tool is only ever a tool. And I think there are lots of strengths to the RBA as a tool. And I've used it only 2 or 3 times, or only with 2 or 3 different organisations. But we've always got valuable stuff out of it. Though I have to say the most valuable stuff in all of the times I've used it has been the conversations about what does success really look like, rather than the measurements. But it can be quite useful. The thing is not to get obsessed or straitjacketed by it, because if you've only got a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, even if it's a screw. And I've tried to nail in screws. They don't work, let me tell you. You don't need to make that mistake twice. So, in the end, we need to fit it for ourselves. And it comes back to that other point, which I think is the big point, that we are more powerful than we realise. We have more control over more things than we sometimes enact. So we need to take control. That doesn't mean we'll win every battle tomorrow, but by believing that we can make a difference and that we have something of value that others need, not that we're just victims that have to do what everyone else tells us to do. I think that's the big change that helps us use this tool or that tool in a way that applies something meaningful and useful for us, as well as for everyone else.
I'm shortly going to ask, that was very aspirational, Garth. I'm shortly going to ask Annelise and Kim to follow on from that and tell us how the future looks from their perspective further down the path, if the future is looking rosy. But before I do that, I actually feel that there's a future webinar to be had here about the learning organisation and what learning organisations look like, and I'd even be delighted to invite the 3 of you back to comment on that, because we're just getting to the point of saying, how does it look if we claim this space for ourselves? Now, if you'd like to see what the great Garth Nowland-Foreman has to say on this topic, when the great Jan Hind manages to screen share, there we go. I'm going to show you a paper which Garth wrote, which we called a think piece, about looking at design, how non-profits might identify, understand, and report on their effectiveness and results. And it's here on our website, and I'll show people how to get to it. I was previously on the page which we call What Works. And at the bottom, you'll see that we wrote a consultation document. And I remember reading this and just thinking it was actually stuffed with really good examples, Garth, of some of the systems, well, let's call them systems, some of the ways of working that nonprofits are using to make sure that they build reflection and build into their practice the practice of passing on their learnings to others, both internally, within their own teams and within their own communities, and to those learning partners who need to be able to learn from them. And we know that that includes policymakers and funders as well. So I really enjoyed that piece of work that you did for us, Garth, and it really sort of led to the What Works website being conceptualized, or the What Works project. I think I've finished screen sharing now. I'm going to unmute. I'm going to mute and pass over now to you two to say, if you were to look further down the line, we've been talking today about the state of the sector, and we've been talking about outcomes and accountability and how we can claim this space for us ourselves. So if you look further down the line, tell us, what would you see there?
What's your thoughts?
I'm very active in the kaupapa Māori research arena, and have had the privilege of participating in a series of workshops last year that were facilitated by Te Kotahitanga Research Institute from Waikato. And I think there that was a collective of Māori who are working, who are academics and who are doing masters and PhD, and the number of Māori collaborating in that space was overwhelming for me to realise the capacity in the future for Māori communities as a result of those kind of initiatives that are there to support Māori. And in particular, the theme, I guess, that came through loud and clear for me was around moving from resilience to resistance. And I think that that can be a motivation, if you like, for the not-for-profit sector, is that we've become really good at being resilient and handle the jandle and get on and use the number 8 wire and have fights with government around funding, etc., and still getting on with the work, still producing the goods, still gaining momentum and producing really amazing community development initiatives that are having an impact across Aotearoa for communities as small and as huge as and that are happening in the urban environment here in Auckland. But it's, you know, you come to a time where you're chomping at the bit and you're putting so much energy into the resilience and survival that you're always on the back foot, and that maybe it's time for communities in the not-for-profit sector to come together and start talking about resistance as opposed to getting caught up with compliance and getting strangled by reporting and finding the next dollar. So that's my thoughts, just to wrap up. Hilda?
For me, I kind of think about what is it that we want for our children, and what do we want for our future. And I feel excited about some of the young people who are participating in our community, are taking up leadership roles, who are taking on education in ways that our generation may have been a bit slower to do. And I think our future is bright as long as we can continue to read and adapt to the environment and the changing world we live in. And I think as a sector, we need to just continue to do that, continue to question, to reevaluate our vision, to see that vision within the context of our changing community. I've worked for feminist organisations, and I've deeply believed in women's empowerment, and then I've been enrolled where the feedback I'm getting is that we're contributing to young people's relationships being tougher because the young woman's developing and the young guy doesn't have any initiatives that he can engage in. Man, did I have to question my reading of the world that I lived in. And it was one of the best lessons I had. It's made me wake up to those things around us. I don't think business is our enemy. I think there is an untapped potential in regards to the people right now who go to work and they don't have the luxury, or no, they don't have the privilege that we have to work in a sector where we do every day something that's meaningful to us. I think those people are sitting at work thinking, I'd really like to do something that's meaningful to me. I think that's a huge untapped potential in regards to partnership. And I'm thinking that this accountability, the push from government that this is what we need to do, is because their key stakeholders are taxpayers. I think that we really need to engage in what do New Zealanders want for New Zealand. And that's really part of our activism, is to ask more and more New Zealanders to have conversations about what's important to them. And we can do that around the dinner table. It doesn't cost any money.
Yeah. Garth, the final 10 seconds from you.
Yes, I don't want to add anything to that, and certainly don't want to detract from some fantastic points, but just the mention of the word resilience prompted one other thought for me. There's some research about what enabled businesses and a small group of community organisations, mostly businesses, bounce back after the Christchurch earthquake. And people thought it would be a whole lot of things, like did you have a recovery plan in place, did you do this or the other. There were some things that helped, some things that made absolutely no difference, for example having a recovery plan. But the thing that made the biggest difference was having what I've called, not the authors of the report because they don't seem to highlight this as much as I read it, what I've called strategic inefficiency. Like every time I fly overseas, I like it that the fact that those planes have 2 engines. they can get by on one, but they still have one that they don't need. That's what I call strategic inefficiency. And it was the organisations that had space to think, space to do things differently, a little bit of duplication, a little bit of inefficiency that actually bounced back fastest and most effectively after the earthquake, after a shock. And I think that's what happens with any shock or any external pressure. And I think part of reclaiming our agenda, which has been a bit of a theme of our discussion this morning, I think is that we also reclaim some strategic inefficiency. Yeah. A lot of that's been screwed out of our organisations, the spare space in the name of efficiency, but it's actually a very short-term efficiency that undermines our capacity to perform in the long run.
Okay, thanks for watching, everyone. We had a final word just came in from Kate Hyatt at the Wellington Community Trust there saying, and we also want to develop relationships with trusts. Okay, thanks everybody for watching. We're actually going to stay on, we'll hang around and we'll take any further questions that do come in from you, but we're just going to say goodbye from all of us. We hope to see you in a future webinar. Don't forget that in 1 month's time, Margie Jean Malcolm, this is going to be a great event. Margie Jean Malcolm will be presenting about leadership as learning, learning as leadership. She's going to be presenting in quite an interactive workshop format, the findings of her PhD. And we know for those of us working in the community sector, that's really something to look forward to. And we're just going to give you all a wave to say goodbye from all of us. Thanks for those who stays on to the bitter end, and we'll see you next time at our next webinar.